Well, hey friends. Okay, so here's what. You've got all the context, and here's what's going on in this story. It's a huge story and one of my favorites. Because not only does it lead to inclusion, but it forces the disciples to start to have to make a decision based on what they know or perhaps think they know about the Torah, about the scriptures, about the Bible. And they change, they adapt. They don't erase, they don't put something in the past and say that is no more at all, but they expand. And that's what this passage is about, and this is why I love it so much. It's about expansion. Paul and Barnabas have been all over the country, bouncing back and forth from town to town, up and down the dial, and they have been now really opening up this movement to Gentiles. So far, what's been going on in the story is these new converts to this Jesus movement, who are all Jewish, have primarily been reaching out to other Jews. They've been expanding that reach. But here with Paul and Barnabas, we start to get a heavy focus on Gentiles, and they are opening up this movement to them, and it is growing. It is like wildfire. They thought they were having problems with the Hellenist widows a few chapters ago. Well, now this thing is just bursting at the seams. But here's the deal with this movement that we have to remember. It is, at its beginnings, a Jewish movement. And if it's a Jewish movement, then that means that any males who come into the faith must be circumcised. Now, what about the females? Who knows? One of the problems in this story and throughout the scriptures that we've talked a lot about is the total and utter erasure of women. They are not even a factor in this story, unfortunately. But suffice that to say, for now, what the problem they're having is, what do we do with this massive influx of male converts who some of the leaders back from Jerusalem who had come down, north to Antioch and such, were saying that they must be circumcised, which it's always awkward to start talking about these body parts in church, yes. But as you can tell, this is a problem. This is a difficult thing. It's not just like they need to be baptized or they need some other spiritual rite. This is a medical procedure that they need. And so there's this great debate. It says right there in the scriptures that they had this great debate. And sometimes we like to think of this early church as this perfect little utopia where they just, whenever there's a problem, they just get into the scriptures and prayer and then everything is solved. But we see right here that there was actually a big fight. This was a big internal fight. What do we do about this? Because when it comes to all these laws in the Torah, one of the biggest, one of the most significant, goes all the way back to Abraham, not even Moses, but back to Abraham, is that males need to be circumcised. So this is a huge issue, and they go through this big fight. Now, we need to back up a little bit to Acts chapter 10, when Peter had this great vision, this dream of these unclean animals coming down, and God says, kill and eat, Peter. And Peter says, no way, those are unclean animals. And God says, essentially, don't call unclean, don't call profane what I now call clean. And Peter kind of wakes up that things are expanding, things are changing, things are growing out. They're not erasing anything from the past. It's not like a linear thing where this is back here and was, and now we're over here and this doesn't matter anymore. It's more like there's a center and it just keeps expanding. And so what happens in this argument, in this debate, is Peter gets up and he basically preaches a little sermon that you just heard, but I want you to hear it again because these words are very powerful. Starting in verse 7, it says, after there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, "My brothers," of course, this was all men in this scenario, "you know that in the early days God made a choice among you that I should be the one through whom the Gentiles would hear the message of the good news and become believers. And God, who knows the human heart, testified to them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as God did to us. And in cleansing their hearts by faith, God has made no distinction between them and us. Now, therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing on the neck of the disciples a yoke that neither our ancestors nor we have been able to bear? On the contrary, we believe that we will be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, just as they will." I think the only way to describe that little speech by Peter there is, well, a mic drop. He didn't have a microphone, but that was a mic drop moment. And from there, they ultimately decide that there is no reason for these Gentile converts into this Jesus movement need to be circumcised. Why? Primarily because it would be prohibitive. It would get in the way of what God is trying to do, because it might actually turn people away. And turn people away for what? An ancient rite and ritual that Jewish men had been practicing for thousands of years, and which, by the way, there is a lot of beauty in what goes on in these ceremonies around circumcision. It's called a bris, and there's in no way, shape, or form am I trying to disparage that, but it's not the culture, it's not the history, it's not the tradition of the Gentiles. And so if we try to make it be that, we're going to lose people. We're going to lose potential disciples. We're going to lose people who are longing for the love of God, for the breath of life in their life to come, because we're stuck on something that belongs to this one sort of old school original group. But God is expanding this movement, remember? It's moving outwards, not just geographically, but socially, politically, all of it. God is expanding this. I want you to think about this, and I think this story, and it's why I find it so fundamental, and that's because there is an adaptation, a change of how they're understanding the Bible, which is a big problem in today's world. We have groups of Christians that read this Bible, and they take it so literally that it can never be interpreted in different ways, that the culture in which we live and the movements that God is doing among us might be reinterpreting some things or expanding the interpretation of things. And this passage is an example of the very early disciples, the church, the early church doing just that, allowing the Spirit of God to move so that so that it can expand, so that the movement can expand. So this is how I think about this. It's kind of maybe sort of a silly image, but I picture a balloon. And what happens with balloons? You get a little balloon and you blow some air into it and it expands. And you keep blowing more air into it and it expands and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more beautiful. But what also happens? The more air you put into it, the more afraid you are that it's going to burst. And so it is human nature to hold back, to not push it too far, because what if it bursts and then we don't have a balloon? I think that's what's going on with some of these Jewish converts in this story. The Spirit of God is blowing her breath into this balloon, blowing up this balloon of faith, this balloon of God's activity in the world, which is a way of defining God's grace. God's grace is the active work of the Spirit in the world and in our lives. And so here's the Spirit blowing the breath of life into this balloon of our faith, and it's expanding and it's expanding and it's expanding. And the people are getting nervous that it's going to pop. But we have to trust. We have to trust that God knows what she's doing. The Spirit of God knows what she's doing, and she can continue to blow air into that balloon, and it can continue to expand. And we might start to feel real tense about it. You know how that is, where you're like, it's going to burst. And I think that's what they're feeling in this story. But I think that's what is happening in this story is that the faith is expanding, and it's got a tension to it. But if we trust the Spirit of God, we can believe that the balloon won't burst, and we can continue to expand it. You know, this has been happening in Christianity over and over and over again. There once used to be a fierce battle between Protestants and Catholics, to the point where literal wars broke out, right? You know, particularly in Ireland not that long ago, about who's right and who's wrong and how expansive can this faith be. There have been great movements by women to push and expand for their leadership and their role in the church, thanks be to God. And there were a lot of men in those days that thought if we let all these women come in and lead and be pastors and be clergy and be bishops and be all the things, this thing's going to burst. It's going to fall apart. It's happened more recently with the LGBTQ community. 30, 40 years ago in churches like this, there were conversations about what to do with people who identify as gay, who have same-sex attraction. And you, thankfully, were a pioneering church in allowing that breath of God's Spirit into the balloon of our faith and expand it. We're really seeing this today, right now, with the trans community, who's not only expanding our faith, but is completely expanding our understanding of what gender even means. And it can be scary because it shakes some of our foundations. What I've found is if we step back, we trust the Spirit of God, and we let her breathe into our balloons, breathe into this balloon of our faith, we find this beautiful expansion, and this balloon begins to blow up into something much bigger and much more beautiful than we ever could have imagined. That's what's happening in this story, beloved. I think this is happening right now in just the way we even organize ourselves as a congregation, in terms of who is our community, who is a member, who belongs. It's not just the people on the books. It's not just the people in the pews. And y'all matter, don't get me wrong. But we're expanding our understanding of who our community is, broadening it to our neighborhood, broadening it to even beyond our neighborhood, looking at this entire world as our parish, which is what John Wesley said, the world is my parish. And in order to do that, we have to let go of trying to control and minimize just how big the balloon can be blown up because we're afraid it's going to pop. We got to trust the Spirit of God knows what she's doing. This beautiful, ever expansive God that we serve is moving in new ways, and we need to let her move.